You walk into the review already half convinced this is finally the year it pays off. Not because you got lucky, because you earned it. You stayed late when the deadline slipped. You fixed work that was already supposed to be finished. You joined the quick sync that became an hour. You answered Slack messages after dinner. You kept the project moving when the person above you went quiet. And for months, people kept saying the same thing. You're reliable. You're critical. You've been exceptional. Then your manager smiles, says, "We really value everything you do," and slides the number across the table. 3%. That is the moment something in your brain stops trusting the ritual. Because the words were big, the number was small. And deep down, you can feel the insult hiding inside the politeness. Not open disrespect. Something colder than that. A system that knows exactly how much praise to give you before giving you almost nothing. That's what makes this kind of raise so confusing. It sounds like recognition, but it feels like theater. And that is the first trap. You think the small raise means the company saw your work clearly and priced it accordingly. But for a lot of employees, that number says less about their individual year than they think. Because once you step back from your own review and look across the broader pattern, something starts to feel off. Different people, different teams, different levels of effort, different amounts of praise. And yet the raises often land in a strangely narrow band. Not identical, just close enough to make the message obvious. In recent compensation planning surveys, U.S. salary increase budgets for 2025 were projected around the mid-3% range. WTW put it at 3.7%. Mercer projected total salary increase budgets around 3.7%, with merit increases closer to 3.3%. Other major surveys landed in roughly the same zone. That matters for one reason. If the available pool is already clustered that tightly, your review may feel highly personal while the outcome is being shaped by something much more standardized. That is why so many people leave these meetings feeling disoriented. The language sounds custom. The number feels preloaded. You get told you were a huge part of the team's success. You get thanked for your ownership. You get praise for your attitude, your consistency, your maturity, your willingness to step up. And then the compensation side of the conversation arrives, sounding almost strangely modest, careful, contained, managed. Great work, but budgets were tight. Strong year, but this is where we landed. You're doing everything right, but this is the increase. That gap is where people start doubting themselves. Maybe I didn't stand out enough. Maybe I should have pushed harder. Maybe exceptional didn't really mean exceptional. But sometimes the real story is simpler than that. The review felt personal. The number was standardized. And once you see that, the next question gets much more uncomfortable. If the raise was constrained before the conversation even started, then what exactly was the review really for? That leads to the part most companies never say out loud. Your annual review is not always where your raise gets decided. Very often, it is where the decision gets explained. Because long before you sit down in that room, the company has already been doing math. Finance has a number. HR has a range. Leadership has a budget they are willing to live with. Managers may have some room inside it, but they are usually not walking in with a blank page and full freedom to reward people however they want. They are walking in with constraints. That is why the whole ritual can feel so strangely disconnected. Your manager may be completely sincere when they say you had a great year. They may genuinely believe you deserve more, and still, the final number lands inside a corridor that was built before your story ever entered the room. This is where a lot of employees get the psychology wrong. They think the company looked at their work, weighed it carefully, and came up with a number that reflected their value. But many systems do not work like that. They start with what the company is willing to spend. Then they distribute meaning around that number. That is why reviews can feel emotionally rich and financially thin. You hear about impact, you hear about growth, you hear about leadership potential. Then the compensation part sounds like a separate universe. Because in a way, it is. The system was not confused, it was budgeted. And that distinction matters. Because once you believe the raise was a pure verdict on your worth, you start swallowing the wrong lesson. You start thinking the gap must be you. Not strategic enough, not visible enough, not impressive enough, not patient enough. But sometimes the company is not measuring you in an open field. It is managing you inside a narrow one. And if that is true, then the real question is no longer, why didn't they value me more? It becomes something colder. If annual raises are boxed in this tightly, where does real compensation movement actually happen? That movement usually does not happen where most employees are told to look. It does not happen in the polite annual ritual where everyone gets thanked, calibrated, and moved a few inches. It happens in the exceptions. Promotion budgets, retention adjustments, market corrections, off-cycle changes. The moments when the company suddenly decides the situation is important enough to break its own usual restraint. And that tells you something. The company may say money is tight during review season, but across the same year, many employers still make bigger moves when the reason feels urgent enough. Recent compensation data has shown that one-level promotions often come with increases closer to the high single digits, around 8.5% to 9.3%. Many employers also plan promotions for roughly 1 in 10 workers, and more than 60% report using off-cycle adjustments tied to promotion, retention, or market pressure. So the money does exist, it just does not move evenly. That is the part that stings. You can spend a year believing effort is the main lever. You work harder, you become more dependable, you clean up messes, you make your manager's life easier. You assume that if you make yourself valuable enough, the system will eventually reward you in a straight line. But companies do not always pay in straight lines. They pay when risk appears. They pay when someone might leave. They pay when a title has to change. They pay when the market embarrasses their pay structure. They pay when inaction becomes expensive. Merit raises are how companies preserve order. Real money moves when the system feels pressure. That is why two messages can exist at the same time. We think highly of you, and this is all we can do right now. Sometimes both are true, but that does not make the gap any less real. It just means you are finally seeing the logic underneath it. Annual review is where the company maintains fairness theater. Bigger compensation moves happen when the company is forced to react. And once you understand that, another ugly truth comes into focus. What if staying calm, loyal, and patient is exactly what keeps your price low? For a lot of people, that is exactly what happened. They stayed. They learned the systems. They became the person who knew where things were buried. They trained new hires. They handled the awkward client. They carried the handoff nobody else wanted. They became useful in the quiet, unglamorous way companies depend on every day. And that usefulness often gets mistaken for leverage. It is not the same thing. Because the labor market does not always reward the person who proved the most. Very often, it rewards the person who changed context. Recent wage data has shown that job changers have continued to outpace job stayers. The exact gap moves over time, but the pattern keeps showing up. People who move often grow their pay faster than people who remain loyal and wait. That should bother you, because it means the system can benefit from your stability while paying a premium for someone else's movement. The coworker who leaves may suddenly get a market-priced offer. The person who joins may come in closer to current market reality. Meanwhile, the person who stayed and kept everything running can drift further and further away from that reality without noticing it all at once. That is how pay compression starts to feel personal. You look around and something does not add up. The newer person seems to be landing surprisingly high. The external offer sounds much cleaner than your internal raise history. The market kept moving. Your salary moved in careful little steps. And over time, the distance became expensive. Not overnight, not dramatically, quietly. That is why loyalty can feel noble and costly at the same time. You thought you were building trust. Sometimes you were building discount. The system often rewards changing your price more than proving your value. And that is the real damage of small raises repeated over time. It is not just that one review felt disappointing. It is that year after year, the gap compounds. Not only in money, but in bargaining power, confidence, and your sense of what is normal. By the time you realize it, you are not just underpaid, you are behind. And this is where the insult becomes harder to dismiss. Because even when a small raise looks acceptable on paper, it often does not feel like progress in real life. A company can point to the percentage and say it was fair, competitive, in line with the year. But that is not how employees experience compensation. Employees experience it through rent, groceries, insurance, childcare, debt, commuting, and the low-grade exhaustion of noticing that everything keeps costing more while your pay keeps moving in careful, forgettable increments. That is why a mid-3% raise can feel emotionally dead on arrival. Yes, inflation cooled compared with the spike years. But a cooler number is not the same as relief. Consumer prices still rose, real earnings improved only modestly, health coverage costs kept climbing. So even when your raise technically beats inflation, the lived experience may still feel thin. You do not walk out of the review thinking, my life has materially changed. You walk out thinking, that was supposed to feel bigger. And that gap matters more than companies like to admit. Because compensation is not just math. It is messaging. It tells employees what their extra effort was worth inside the institution. It tells them whether the late nights, the emotional restraint, the invisible cleanup work, and the constant availability translated into something solid. When the answer is a little, technically, people feel the truth immediately. On paper, you got a raise. In real life, you bought almost nothing new. That is why these conversations leave such a bitter aftertaste. The company wants the number to feel like recognition, but once basic costs keep rising and the increase barely changes your margin, recognition starts to feel symbolic. And symbolic pay creates a very dangerous emotion at work. Not rage, not even shock. Erosion. The slow realization that you are being asked to keep performing at a high level while the reward stays small enough to normalize disappointment. So why do so many people stay inside this pattern even after they see it? Because most people are not confused. They are cornered. They have rent. They have parents getting older. They have kids. They have debt. They have immigration status, health insurance, a fragile job market, a manager they do not trust, and just enough exhaustion to keep postponing the bigger decision. And then there is the most powerful force of EDK, hope. Hope that next cycle will be different. Hope that this manager will finally fight for you. Hope that the promotion conversation is real this time. Hope that staying steady will eventually be recognized properly. That hope keeps a lot of people in place longer than they meant to stay. Not because they are weak, because the system is easier to endure 1 year at a time than to confront all at once. And the less visibility people have into pay, the longer that logic survives. If salary ranges are unclear, if coworkers do not talk, if new hire offers stay hidden, if internal compensation logic stays sealed inside HR language, then employees are left to interpret small raises as personal verdicts. That is how the system protects itself. It turns structure into self-doubt. You think, maybe this is just what I'm worth here. Maybe I need to prove more. Maybe I'm still one cycle away. But the deeper truth is often harsher and more useful than that. You were not being fully valued. You were being managed inside a range. And once you understand that, something important changes. You stop reading every small raise as a clean moral judgment on your performance. You stop mistaking praise for leverage. You stop assuming loyalty will correct itself over time. And you start seeing annual review for what it often is, not a pure measurement of your value. A controlled conversation inside the company's comfort zone. That realization does not instantly fix the problem, but it does remove one of the most damaging lies in modern work. That if the raise was small, your contribution must have been too. If this has happened to you, then you already know the worst part was never just the number. It was the script around the number. The praise, the pause, the careful tone, the feeling that you were supposed to walk away grateful for something that barely moved your life. That is why these reviews stay with people. Not because the raise was small, but because the company made it sound like a verdict on your worth. And a lot of the time, it wasn't. If you've ever been told you're doing exceptional work and still got a raise that felt strangely pre-decided, leave a comment below. I want to know what your review sounded like and whether the number matched the story. If this video put words to something you felt at work for a long time, subscribe to Wolf at Work. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.